really glad that you made the time to speak with Bronx Narratives today. And actually, I feel like it's a good time that we're speaking because about, I would say 7 years ago to this day, you were on our 9th episode for the podcast.
That's wild to even think about. Like
Yeah.
I can't even tell you how. I mean, well, you get it. There's a lot that's changed
Yes,
for me, but yeah,
yes.
it's like this beautiful, super duper beautiful full circle moment.
Right. I was just gonna say that.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
like it just works out us wanting to speak to you again at this time as we're coming upon our 10-year anniversary. So
So
it's just
cool.
like celebrating wins together, so
Yeah,
that's great.
yeah, yeah. And like
Um
10 years is it's so incredible, especially in
yeah,
a market where, listen, like not not a lot of people making it past year 2, year 3, year 5. And I think that's just a testament to like the work that that BN has been doing, both on like the creative side, but then also in the community as well. It's important.
I agree. I definitely agree. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit because, as I said, we're celebrating our 10-year, and
Yeah,
we're doing that through the summer up to the actual date of our anniversary with this campaign that we're calling Untapped. And it's
yeah,
basically repositioning the Bronx as this untapped utopia with hidden gems, right? So we
mm,
are
yeah,
highlighting people and places that are not only influential to the Bronx, but that we wanted to recognize as storytellers and people who represent the Bronx well. And
yeah.
uh, with that being said, I know that I don't know if I can consider you quite untapped anymore, but it's still great to have you nonetheless.
No, no, no. I'm on tap. Tap me up. Tap me up,
Okay.
Kayla. I think.
Okay,
No,
cool. So
I think. Yeah.
yeah. All right. So
No, go on, sis. I'm
just
sorry. Go on.
yeah, no problem. Just to jump in, right? And this interview is not even going to be long, but as you said, I'm going to try to have you while we have you. So the first question that I wanted to pose to you was,
Yeah.
um, what made the Bronx home for you growing up?
Ooh.
Mm,
Um. I think that the topic gets. I think the theme that the word gets overused a lot, but it was the culture.
mm,
It was the culture. The culture of the Bronx is so unique and so interesting and so also incredibly important. When I think of culture, I think of all the intersections of culture that happen in the Bronx on a consistent daily basis. The music, the art, the fashion. I like to say the flavor of the Bronx, right? Like, and that's not even just through the lens of food, but like the Bronx has a very distinct flavor, personality, tonality to it that you only can appreciate, not even only from being from there, but being willing to get curious about the Bronx and what the Bronx has to offer. I think folks go to Yankee Stadium or they'll just get stuck in the South Bronx and like that is beautiful. But whether we're thinking about, yes, the South Bronx, but then also too the Lit Bar. Are we talking about, you know, the Bronx Library Center? Are we talking about the Botanical Gardens? Are we talking about Van Cortlandt Park? Are we talking about um are we talking about the Bronx Zoo? Like we also think of the landmarks, but so much of that is like, I'm from Fordham Road, I'm from Preston Avenue. So like there's so many memories I have, and all those memories and that culture is what essentially is help to make me. Like I don't say this lightly, but there's no Joel without the culture of the Bronx.
mm. I hear you. So would you say that the Bronx still has that culture, that flavor today? Does it still exist there here?
I mean, I think so. I think so. I think so. I think it exists in different ways.
Mm,
I think I think so much of, I mean, everything changes, right? Everything changes, environments change, systems change, people change, gentrification happens. Some people just move because they're looking for a different pace of living. So, like, I think the Bronx has changed, but I think, when I think about the Bronx, I also think of the essence of hip hop. And so there's hip hop that I listen to, right? That maybe the Gen Z audience might not.
Mhm.
Oh, 1 second. Might not be listening to, but I think of the Bronx in the same way. There's like pockets of culture that exist that maybe I might not be privy to anymore, or I might not be partaking in. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist anymore. And I think it brings up a bigger conversation of like what exists and for whom and to whom. And I
Mhm.
think it's easy to kind of try to negate the experience of others who are coming after us when like they're experiencing the Bronx in a whole new different kind of way that maybe I wasn't or I
Mhm.
haven't gotten able to. So I think it does very much exist. I think it just exists in a different way now.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and you mentioned like the Bronx changing for different reasons, and one of those reasons being, another generation coming and
Yes.
affecting culture. Another reason that you mentioned was also like people coming and going,
Mm-hmm.
the transience
Yeah.
of life, basically. Uh,
Yeah.
and that actually points to one of the questions that we had was, I know that you currently live in Brooklyn now, right? So that's
Yeah.
a
Yes.
completely different flavor, well, I'm not going to say completely different, but it is
But
different,
it's yeah, for sure. For
right?
sure.
So, what were some of the factors? What were some of the things that contributed to your move and your new phase and your new space?
I mean, honestly, partnership. My
Mm,
my my my, my partner Bree was already established in Brooklyn,
mhm,
by way of California. And it made sense. And it made sense really only because of that. Like I was already in the Bronx and I left the Bronx to be with her. And then like we started our family there. And so it was more than anything else. I think if I'm being honest, living in Brooklyn, specifically Bed-Stuy, because this is not all of Brooklyn, but Bed-Stuy is so unique because yes, gentrification is also affecting Bed-Stuy, it's affecting all parts of New York, but there's so much blackness in Bed-Stuy and like
sorry, 1 minute. I don't.
girl,
Can you?
I had to do listen, no, girl, you look so good.
Okay,
But
continue.
not
I'm sorry.
but no, girl, Kayla, you're fine. But like
Yeah.
there's a certain kind of blackness that exists in Bed-Stuy that is very like African American blackness. I grew up in the Bronx and primarily like while it was diasporic, it was so much of like the Afro Caribbean diaspora, right?
Mhm.
So like we're talking like Haitians, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans. It's like the island flavor. And not to say that doesn't exist in Brooklyn, but you're dealing in Bed-Stuy with like black people, like
Mhm.
Southern cultural roots, like migration happening, like intrastate. And so it's a very different experience for me. And it's a thing that's actually been beautiful. And like part of that has just been recognizing that there's a different language that gets spoken. Like I grew up around Dominicans and Puerto Ricans, and so like shout out to my Boricuas. Like I've learned so much from that. And then also too, what's been really beautiful is just to have black community and have that in Bed-Stuy. Because we have that in pockets of the Bronx, but like I have so many black neighbors in Bed-Stuy. So like I think that's also been a really beautiful part of the experience in me.
Mhm. Oh, and that's amazing. I I guess what are some of the differences, being in a predominantly Afro-Caribbean environment and then moving to a predominantly African American one? Has there been a culture shock? How have you had to adjust in some ways? You mentioned language.
Yeah, language, and then I mean also too. There's a certain again. I want to be clear. This is so very Bed-Stuy specific, but there's a
Mm,
certain kind of cultural language that feels almost very Southern. Like black people acknowledge each other in the street. It's a thing that like sometimes might happen in Harlem, but I never got that growing up in the Bronx because that's not customary. Like so much of what I grew up around was us also having to face so much systemic racism and pressures from outside forces of the borough that I think kept us tight. It
mm,
kept us wound up. And not to say that doesn't exist where I'm at now, but it is like me passing a black man and us acknowledging each other with the head nod. Like that to me is very much the cultural language that I'm thinking of. It's like the ways that people maneuver in spaces with each other, and it's a knowing that happens that you don't actually have to verbally communicate, which has been very special and actually really important for me. And recognizing how much I needed that. As a person who also has like Southern roots, like my father's from Pensacola, Florida, and and also even Midwestern roots that also has a very much a similar tenor and flavor when we're talking about like the Southernness. Having that in Bed-Stuy has been really special for me. And also too, I think I was kind of talking about it, the way the Bronx gets overlooked because of because we don't get the same resources, right? There's this assumption that the Bronx is really far out, which it is, but there are parts of Brooklyn that are super far out. But if you look at a Brownsville or East New York, you know what I'm saying? You can also see a very similar thing happening in those areas of Brooklyn as well, where a lack of resources also leads to folks being a bit more closed off to their environments and sometimes not even treating their environments like their own. And so while I always feel ownership over Creston Avenue, like I can't just walk up to Creston Avenue now, you know what I'm saying? Because I'm not on the block anymore. And so there's a tug and pull that exists in ways that I don't necessarily feel being where I'm at in Bed-Stuy specifically,
Yeah. And just pointing to the nuances of the Bronx being having that lack of resource and you can let me know if you are familiar with this sentiment, but there's a book called I'm looking at my notes just in case you see me, but there's a book called Just Kids from the Bronx. And there was a particular, it's basically like an anthology of different stories, different oral stories written down as they interviewed people who lived in the Bronx through different decades. And one of the stories mentioned that the Bronx is basically just a place where people pass through, and then maybe they come back once they've established themselves. So it's almost as if they leave in the height of cultivating themselves.
Yeah.
They do that somewhere else, and then they come back a little later. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. Do you agree that the Bronx is almost kind of this place where people pass through and cultivate somewhere else? Well, they cultivate themselves here, but then they I guess they display the highest points of their talent somewhere else.
Yeah. I think people treat it as such. Do I think that's true? No. And I'll explain. I think I actually think the Bronx is so much more than that. It's so much more than that. But I do think it's treated as such sometimes. I mean, there's an essay in my book, Everything and Nothing at Once, where it's called Survivor's Guilt, and it's me talking about leaving the Bronx and moving to Brooklyn. And so part of my work has been to try to continue to come back and pour back into the borough, even though I'm no longer there physically. My mom is still out there. My mom is still on Creston, right? And so, but I think there's something to be said for certain kinds of communities that people use to learn their story, to maybe even amplify their learnings of their story. And then it's no different than like the we talk about white flight, but black flight is a real thing where you get established and then you leave. And ideally what would happen is people would be able to stay in the same place that they're establishing themselves at. And that's hard to do, to be fair and to be frank, especially when we're talking about underserved communities, right? Where if you don't have the resources, you know what I'm saying? Like there's so many writing workshops that happen in Brooklyn on a daily basis that I can physically go to. And, when you're dealing with, again, a borough that has been stripped of its resources, right? Like the Lit Bar should not be the only bookshop in the Bronx. You know what I'm saying? Like there shouldn't only be one movie theater in the Bronx, but yet here we are. When you strip those things away from communities, you also strip away community. And it makes it very hard for people to thrive, especially if you're creative. Like you have to also get really creative. And so part of what I would love to do, what I want to do, and what I plan on doing is also like, how do I bring the community building ways that I've learned from being in Brooklyn as an adult and bringing that back to the borough? Like, is that like, how do we build in community spaces that aren't just community centers, but they're multi-generational spaces where people get to play, reimagine, get creative, do things in support of growing and expanding community. But a lot of that unfortunately happens because people leave the borough to gain the things. And sometimes that's going to another borough. Sometimes it's traveling out of the country. Because if you're a Black person growing up in an impoverished, underserved community, sometimes you have to leave in order to find some level of freedom and liberation, in order to bring those learnings back to the place that you left.
Yeah, yeah. So to just what I'm getting from that is basically like, I don't necessarily think it's an issue to leave and have new experiences and build on what you are trying to cultivate. But I think the difference is when you have to, because there is a lack of resources, or there is a lack of creative spaces or multi-generational spaces where people can thrive where they are if they choose to, and also leave and explore if they choose to do that as well, right? So then, yeah. So
Absolutely.
yeah. Sorry.
No,
Continue.
that was great with you. That was it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So and that was one of the talking points, and one of the things that we wanted to discuss, and you touched on it, was basically like, what are some things the Bronx might need in order to have people stay, or at least have the option, whether or not they want to stay or go. And you touched on that beautifully. So thank you for that. And thank you for sharing your experience about like having I don't want to say it was a struggle, but the thought of being here and also leaving and going someplace else as well. Yeah.
I mean, Kayla, and I'll give you an example. Like, I think about the Center for Fiction in Brooklyn. And it's a beautiful display of like creative architecture, right? Like, and it's a thing if we're like, I can't imagine right now a Center for Fiction living in the Bronx because so many things are happening in isolation. We're isolated from community. And that is very much by way of capitalism. Capitalism does an excellent job of separating us from our art and from each other. Mayor Adams has done a wonderful job of just shitting on everything. So it's like this notion of, because like I bring up the Center for Fiction because it's like it's all glass, right? Like the entryway is glass, and it's like it's also placed in a way where they're not expecting harm to happen to the space. And that's a very tricky thing to deal with when you're dealing with a community that is not accustomed to having nice things placed with them, where safety isn't a concern. Where we're not used to having nice things where safety is not actually deemed a concern. So it's like chicken or the egg. Like, you want to build the space. Is the space safe enough for people to enter and come and go? Or it's just been having to be honest and having honest conversations about what safety looks like and what community looks like. And that's what we need. We need community spaces. We need greener spaces. We need, you know what I'm saying? Like, community gardens you shouldn't have to go to the botanical gardens to like actually have a community garden. And then like the beautifying of spaces is important. More creative spaces, more people honestly coming back to the Bronx to do more creative things here, even if you're not from the Bronx. There are so many transplants in Brooklyn, so many transplants. And so I think there's a pride we have in the Bronx, but also too, this is why I'm so grateful for this conversation, because I never want to be seen as a Brooklynite. I live in Brooklyn, but I'm from the Bronx, and I take the Bronx with me everywhere I go. And so part of that is like, how are we opening pathways and spaces for people to share their knowledge, their wisdom, and their understanding and experience with other people who maybe haven't had the chance to do so? Because so many of us also just stay. And the staying is important, but I think actually the leaving is just as important and paramount.
Yeah. So I think that is a great transition into the idea of a utopia and what is an ideal living space. And I mean, I don't want to use perfection, but ideal. And I guess hearing a little bit of that, I wanted to pose this question to you. what is an idea? What is your concept of a utopia? What does that mean to you? What does that look like?
A utopia is no police force, it's no prisons, it's no jails. Um, it's us learning the language of community and abolition. It means being in spaces with people we disagree with and loving them anyway. Um, I think this is idea of like perfect community, and I think perfect community is being able to deal with the imperfections of community. Like we all have different varying experiences, backgrounds, prejudices, biases, and so the true effort of being an abolitionist is understanding those differences, making space for those differences, holding space for forgiveness, for accountability, and to be frank and to be fair, which is a very scary thing to talk about, holding space for harm. There's no world where we're not going to harm each other in some way, shape, or form. That is just a part of our natural human existence. That harm might happen through like emotional, on emotional terms. Ideally, it doesn't happen in physical terms, but that is a possibility where people don't have the language. So much of the work for me has been learning the language, adopting the language, knowing I might get things wrong, but also being loved and accepted for that anyway. And I want the same for others. You know what I'm saying? Like the same dude, the same dude with the do-rag, or like, you know what I'm saying? Like the red flag around his neck. He's no different than the dude or the woman or the non-binary person who's striving for the MFA. You know, and how do we hold space for those different intersections, those disagreements that are going to happen in community, while also walking with each other along the process of like unlearning and learning new things together. Like
Mhm.
that to me is utopia.
Yeah, yeah, and so I think that we kind of established that yes, the Bronx is still quite untapped, but that it is not quite a utopia for the different reasons that you mentioned, like during this conversation. So I guess, and this may seem repetitive, but just to put it out there anyway, in the context of the Bronx, what does it look like for the Bronx to be a utopia?
It's a good question. But I think this is not just central to the Bronx. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Like that conversation around a utopia, we don't have it anywhere. It doesn't exist. It
Mhm.
doesn't exist. There's racism, there's xenophobia, there's misogyny, there's misogynoir. That all these things exist in the Bronx. They also exist in places outside of the Bronx. Um, and so I think in order for us to get there, we need more resources. People are also going to be violent to each other if they're fighting over crumbs. There's not enough resources, and so what do you expect when people don't have tools and language and understanding of self and of each other? Like people are going to resort to violent means. You know, we can look at whether you're talking about the Bronx or you're talking about Palestine. Like people are fighting for their liberation in different ways. You know, Grace Lee Boggs and James Lee Boggs, they don't call rioting rioting; they call rioting revolutions. You know, and so much of that practice is being able. Ah, oh, I thought I lost you. So much of that practice is being able to hold space for all these different multitudes of things to coexist with each other. And some of that is going to be violent. And you see people who are repressed fighting for their freedom in different ways. And some of that freedom comes out in misogynistic ways, it comes in patriarchal ways, it comes out in capitalist ways. Utopia, utopia is more resources because then we can start unpacking the other stuff.
Final question. um, and I heard all of that, and I was going to ask, um, you know, I'll leave that one alone. But so I'll go back to the final question. Um, so if you had to write a love letter to the Bronx, what would an excerpt of that say?
Thank you for loving me. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for providing me a place and a space to play, to reimagine, to reinvent, to create, to learn, to love, and to grow. Thank you for shepherding me into this world and also preparing me for my work and for my purpose.
Mm, that's great. And on that note, that is the end of the interview. So I do want to thank you again for taking the time out. As you said before, you are on tour, you're moving, you're hustling, you're bustling. Taking the time out to talk and answer these questions and you know, share your mind on these topics. And I know, well, hopefully this will not be the last time that we cross paths with you. And that we'll be talking with you about the next book that you write. Well, we didn't even get to talk to you about this book, but next time maybe we'll talk to you about this book and then the next one. Although I don't want to rush you. You just finished this, you're on tour. I don't want to talk about what comes next, but just thank you.
Thank you, Kayla. Thank you so much. Thank you for showing up for this work and for this practice. And thank you for the space and opportunity.
Oh, thank you.